the two cases that you brought up, they are Malaysians, right? And then we are doing all the good work on behalf of them. Are there any Malaysian anti-death penalty groups that you can join them, and then you build that coalition so that it strengthens the efforts?
Yeah, there are. So we do work with them very closely because they are Malaysian inmates. Then we do work with the Malaysian groups very closely. There's a civil rights committee in the KL and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall that is always very supportive because one of their EXCO members is a human rights lawyer and an anti-death penalty campaigner herself. And so when we went to KL, they actually organized the press conferences because they had a mailing list, they had the journalists, and they organized all that. And then when we went to Parliament, it was because of the help from the Malaysian Bar and also from the various human rights groups like Swaram. And yeah, so they all came in to help. Amnesty Malaysia as well. And when we went to Sarawak, we had help from the Advocates Association of Sarawak, who then organized the conference. And then the Malaysian Bar, the Association of Lawyers in Sabah, and the Advocates Association of Sarawak all came together and did this press statement for Jabing as well. So we do get a lot of support from Malaysians who campaign against the death penalty.
Hello, because I'm Jiaxing, because I don't know much about the current legal system and assistance for these people who are accused. I'm wondering if the system here provides defense lawyers and certain procedures to help with this process of, say, appeals and everything.
I think Ravi can speak about that a little bit more later during his talk. And Eugene as well. Yeah, but from our perspective, we've often seen, well, firstly for us as campaigners, we get the cases very late because the families tend to think that the court process will come around right, and then they only come to us when the appeal has been lost and they're like, oh God. Then suddenly we get all these influx of like legal documents and everything and people asking for help. But a lot of the cases we've seen, they only get lawyers because there's no guaranteed early access to legal counsel in Singapore. So a lot of them, by the time they get lawyers, they've already said all sorts of incriminating things in their statements. And we've had cases where they've confessed. They've already confessed. Then it becomes very difficult for the lawyer as well, because then what do you do with all these statements that he signed and they're all admissible in court? Then it becomes a problem for us. And we've also seen problems with the amendments, which I think Ravi and Eugene can speak about later. The amendments to the mandatory death penalty has thrown up a lot of like legal messiness that we've seen.
Any more questions?
Sorry, I don't mean to hog the question. There was a case in Singapore where this man, he actually volunteered to be hanged, right? He said that I want to be hanged. And when you have these kind of cases, what are you going to do with it, okay? And then the other point is that right now we're seeing in Indonesia and in Philippines, all these anti-drug campaigns, they're going to so extreme, and then it's going to hurt our cause in the sense that you see in Indonesia, they execute those people, and then in the Philippines, and so we're surrounded by these kind of neighbors, and it's not very encouraging,
From what we've seen, actually, like when it comes to international platforms in the UN, Singapore is the leading voice for the death penalty against drugs. So in a way, it's all feeding into each other. So like, Indonesia can say, but Singapore, Shanmugam went to the UN and gave such a strong defense of the death penalty from drugs. So, our whole region needs to be protected. And so the rhetoric on war against drugs is very, very strong in this region. And it manifests in a different way from than, say, in Latin America, where it's really like literally war, the military is being rolled out. But the rhetoric essentially underlying these are the same, that, we're going to try to eliminate drugs, even though that's, at this point, research is showing that, there's no eliminating drugs, there's only kind of regulation and control and keeping people safe. So that's one that we really need to target, but the discussion about drug reform is very, very low in Singapore. So I've got some calls from people who are researchers on drug policy, and they want to talk to people talking about drug reform in Singapore. And the closest they can find are the anti-death penalty campaigners, because no one else will talk about drugs. Everyone is like, yeah, we need to stamp out drugs, but no one talks about whether this approach is working, whether it actually helps, what are we keeping safe. We still get so many reports of like huge drug hauls, and so many mules are getting hanged, and it doesn't seem to be working, but we are not really talking about whether that's then an issue of policy. So one difficulty we do have, from what I've seen, is that a lot of our work is very case-based, so we focus on this one person, but we have not yet had the resources to talk about it across the board. So say, instead of saying, Wee Kong was very young and he was very disadvantaged, or Chuning was tricked, and we have not yet had a level of discussion where we say, actually this whole drug policy of hanging people is just wrong. Whether they did it or not, the hanging people for drug offenses is just wrong. We haven't really talked about that yet. And also your other question of like, what if someone volunteers to be hanged? We don't have a case yet where someone wanted to be hanged, but we have come across cases where families did not want to campaign. And you have to respect that decision, no matter how strongly you feel about it, because it is true that when you come out on the campaign, all the publicity is going to be on them. And some of them are just really not comfortable with it. So, we've got families say, like, we can't be in the papers. Then all our neighbors will know. Then this boy going to school, everybody will say, oh, your father is on death row. We don't want, the kid to be exposed to that. So there are families who opt out of campaigning. And so in that case, the best that you can offer them is, do you need help proofreading or drafting your clemency letter? What else can we do for you? But not make it public, because it is their choice at the end of the day.
Actually, we, as campaigners, we have many ways to go about doing this. Like, we don't necessarily have to campaign on every single case if the families don't feel comfortable about it, because we have different goals. Like, one of the long-term goal is to abolish the death penalty for all crimes, definitely. But when we take up cases, we are facilitating the families just to try to save their loved ones' lives. So it is reality that we cannot change the system just using one case. So we also do things like we participate in the Universal Periodic Review process, the UPR. We report to the UN about the situation in Singapore. We work with regional groups like Anti-Death Penalty Asian Network, which we are all a part of. So it's things like that we do. And as a region, we organize activities in solidarity with the other groups. In Indonesia, for example, we had a gathering regarding Mary Jane Veloso last year, and then we've got domestic workers writing messages to her and things like that. So this is what we do. Casework is one of the things that we do, but it's not everything. Yeah.
Oh, and another thing I learned is that you cannot assume that every family you work with is anti-death penalty themselves. So that there will be some families who are like, yeah, I don't think my loved one should be on death row, but I don't have a problem with the death penalty in general if it's really bad people, but my loved one is not a really bad person. And that we have to respect as well. Like, so the help and support that we give is not contingent upon them supporting our cause in general. We're just there to help. And if they don't want to be involved in the anti-death penalty campaign in the long run, then that's fine as well.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to ask a question about data collection and information and access to the numbers. Now I know in Singapore I think it's quite difficult to have access. Is what's being done, or is anything being done to try to get numbers? Thank you.
Yeah, so in 2011, during the first universal periodic review that Singapore went under, the government accepted a recommendation to make information related to the use of the death penalty public. And in our experience, that recommendation that they agreed to has not been implemented, or has not been implemented satisfactorily. Because their idea of making information public is that at the end of the year, the Singapore Prison Service publishes their annual report, and then they write down the number of people executed in that year. And then to them, that's make information public. But we want a lot more. We want disaggregated data. We don't want to know at the end of the year how many people were executed. We want to know about upcoming executions. What's the point of knowing if the guy is already hanged? We want to know about upcoming executions. We want to know about the breakdown, male, female, age, economic background, education, nationality. So we've written into the prison before, and they said that they don't make this information public, that they cannot disclose, it's confidential. For Jabing's case, so that was the most recent time I tried to dig for information from them. So we had a meeting, and then it came out that actually 2 people were scheduled for execution on that day. Not just Jabing, there was another person, and we had not heard about this. And so I then called the prison service, and she said, so I called her and I said, I heard that there's a second execution. Can I know who it is and stuff like that? And she said, I can't tell you on the phone. And I said, it's okay, I'm standing outside the prison. I can come in now. And she said, I can't tell you that either. And then, so that got blocked. I sent a formal email request to their communications department. And then I wrote to, and I said, well, who else would know? So I wrote to the Istana, because I said, the president signs those warrants. So they should know. So I wrote to the Istana, and they said, we don't know. And then in the end, they forwarded everything to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Ministry of Home Affairs never got back to me. So again, that was submitted, I think, as evidence, as an addendum to our UPR report this year, that this is really not satisfactory. If they think this is how information related to the use of the death penalty is being put out, then that's just not good enough. So the UN really needs to know that the recommendation has not been taken up.
Linked to that, it's an example of how haphazard the system is, how they're so reluctant to give us information. One of the sources of information when we were looking at the Yong Wee Kong case was through Wee Kong himself. Like if you visit Wee Kong and then you ask him, is anyone scheduled for hanging? And then he might say, oh yeah, I heard that so-and-so, Ah Hong or something is scheduled for hanging. And then you go, okay, who's Ah Hong? And you write it down. But that could just be a nickname, or it could be his real name, or you don't really have complete information. Or sometimes when we were going to see Wee Kong, we would stop to drink coffee at the cafe in Cluster A, and sometimes the guards would get chatty, and then he would then offer up information like, oh yeah, last week we had a hanging, or oh yeah, there's one that's coming up, and if you're lucky and you probe a bit more, he might give you the name, or he might just get a bit more defensive if you ask too many questions and say, oh no, I can't tell you anymore. It's really frustrating because this kind of information, especially information that's related to life and death, should be readily available. If you're going to kill people on behalf of all your citizens, then all your citizens have a right to know who on earth you're killing, when. Expecting us to find information through death row inmates or through chatty guards or through families of death row inmates, that's just not good enough. But then the official channels are not working. So what do we do?
Actually, that reminds me that so Jabing was actually sentenced to death. Sentenced for his execution was scheduled late last year, and then there was a stay, and then it was. So what was especially chilling was that that first time when we heard that clemency had been rejected and the execution would be scheduled, was that Jabing himself predicted the date of his execution based on the inside information that he had. So we didn't have any information, but then Jumai went to see him and she came out and she said, my brother thinks it won't be this week and it won't be next week, it would be the first week of November. And I said, how does he know that? And she said, because he said 2 guys were executed this month already, so the prison doesn't want to do too many in a month, so he doesn't think he'll be in this month, he'll be in the next month batch. And that's what Jabing says he heard. So like all these things you can't officially verify, but that's like, Jabing said he heard from the warden that, they don't want to do too many executions a month, so you don't worry, you'll be safe for October, maybe November you will see. And so Jabing actually accurately predicted the date of his execution that first time, which fortunately there was a stay. But that's how we hear of these things. So like you will go, and then Jumai will come out of prison and she said, Jabing said a Chinese guy was taken away the other day, and you're like, what Chinese guy? What Chinese guy? Like, then you have to go and search like, at what stage is everyone? And it requires LawNet access, so it requires you to either, fortunately in our team, we have people who are trainee lawyers who have LawNet access, so they'll go and find like the court judgments, and from there estimate like, okay, this guy's appeal was rejected quite some time ago, so probably it's him, and then go through that way, but it makes it really difficult to verify everything, and it always is after the fact. And also, everything we know about the execution process at the moment is also from inmates. So, like, the day that Jabing was executed, another inmate told his fiancée who went to visit him the next week that, we know how he was taken away, we know that he was allowed to go to every cell on his block and say goodbye personally to everyone that he knew. He came to my cell and he shook my hand and he told me to be nice to my girlfriend, and then he said goodbye. And then they said, and then he was taken away to a room at the end of the corridor that none of us have ever seen inside this room, but he was taken to that room, and then we heard a thump, and that's how I knew he was gone. And so that again made us realize that, if this guy is right, the execution chamber is in the cell block at the end of the row. And we didn't know that before. So, we don't know if, we have no way, again, to independently verify this, but that's what we hear from the inmates. Yeah.
Okay. One last question.
I'm very interested if there's any research being done to look into a society or country where they have a high acceptance for death penalty versus other country society where there is a very low acceptance, where then manifested in the law where there is no death penalty. Is there any research in this on the condition or?
There is. So like one study we keep pointing to is done by Dr. Jeffrey Fagan and some other researchers, where they compared Singapore and Hong Kong because they felt that both were like small cities with fairly similar levels of development and economic wealth and everything. And they compared the homicide rates. So it wasn't death penalty for drugs, it was death penalty for murder. And what they found is that you can't really say that the death penalty works because the homicide rates in both cities are about the same. They're not significantly different. So what they could infer from that is that it doesn't seem as if the death penalty is an effective deterrence. Because of how complicated kind of crime and law enforcement is, it's very difficult for researchers to say 100% that it works or doesn't work. They can only say it seems to suggest that it doesn't work or there's no evidence that it works. So far we've not seen any researcher come out and say, I have evidence that it works. A lot of them are like, it probably doesn't work, or even if it works, it's not necessarily more effective than other ways.
My question is not on that. My question is that how the society have an acceptance, because if we know some of this property, maybe a campaign can work on a general scale to create a higher social acceptance that then work against, that can put pressure on the government not to have this kind of law.
There are some like public opinion polling. Not in Singapore, but the closest one to us is a opinion survey, a very comprehensive one done by Roger Hood, who was commissioned by the Death Penalty Project in the UK to do the survey. He did it in Malaysia, relating to the death penalty and the mandatory death penalty. And what he did was, he didn't just ask people, like, are you in favor of the death penalty or not? He actually broke down scenarios, and he broke down, like, okay, what if it's the mandatory death penalty where the judge doesn't get a say? And he broke down, and it was found that, you know, people's reactions to the death penalty is a lot more complex and varied than just saying yes or no, I support the death penalty. So he kind of suggested that, you know, maybe you know, if we tackle and got rid of the mandatory death penalty first, that's probably more acceptable to a wider number of people, and then use that as a platform to go ahead to tackle the death penalty as a whole. So these are some ideas that he had from his research, but it has not been done in Singapore yet.
I think what you meant was that as a campaign, we could compare, say, Singapore to Hong Kong. Is that what you're saying?
For example, if a society has a high education value that places a lot of value on humanity, on compassion, then that society may have a lower acceptance to allow death penalty to be carried out. And if we know that, then a campaign can go out to raise kind of educate or advocate for a certain prioritizing on compassion and humanity. And in this way, it exert indirect pressure on the acceptance of death penalty. That's why.
Okay. So speaking as someone who lives mostly in Hong Kong, I'm Singaporean, but I spend most of my time in Hong Kong. Hong Kong doesn't have the death penalty. People generally do not want, you know, the death penalty, and it's still a very, very safe city. It's very competitive. It's you know, it's thriving. It's not falling apart. It also has freedom of expression, freedom of speech. People there value all these things, and they value these things so much they're willing to take to the streets and occupy them for 2 months in order to uphold these values. And despite disrupting the streets for 2 months, the city didn't fall apart. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's an all-encompassing thing. If you want a society that has compassion, that values life, that is into redemption, that wants to give people a second chance, then you also have to promote things like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, you know, all these basic freedoms that free societies take for granted and will fight for. The thing about Singapore is that we're conditioned to think that these things are not necessary. So maybe that's where we need to start.
Okay, I think.
Can I just add? And also, I agree with the need to convince the public, but I also am uncomfortable with the idea of placing it solely on public opinion. So I'm not comfortable with we will do away with the death penalty only when public opinion says we don't like the death penalty, because that sort of majoritarian rule is like, what if the majority of the public decides that we like, you know, public floggings? Do we then say, oh, the public has spoken, we will bring back the public floggings? So I feel like there are certain things that are just rights that should not be subjected to public opinion. So like, Jabing is now dead, but his right to live should not have been subjected to what we in this room and in this country thought. He should have just had the right to live. And that, I understand, is a very difficult sell in a public campaign. And of course, there is importance in public education and changing the public opinion so that you have the support of the public to place pressure on the government. But at the same time, we shouldn't feel that, these rights are only rights when the majority agrees that they are rights. So there are just some things that I feel the government should do better and respect their rights, rather than just say, you know, they only use the excuse of public opinion when it's something they're not really prepared to do. So, you know, they didn't really care about public opinion when they want to build casinos and things. So, you know, I feel like there are just some things that we argue on that basis of principle.